It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kolpashnikova, who's an assistant professor at Western University, which I had to look up because it used to be called University of Western Ontario when I was a postdoc. But rebranding, right? Specializing in time use studies, gendered housework in North American and East Asian societies. Dr. Kolpashnikova holds a PhD in sociology from the University of British Columbia and has earned multiple awards for her recent work, including the recent grants from the SSHRC Insight Grant in 2023 and the Marie Skłodowska Curie Fellowship at the University of Oxford from 2019 to 2022. Her work advances our understanding of empirical matters, but also she works to advance methods in a way that I think is really user-friendly, especially, for instance, the work with ATUS-X data extractors. So I really encourage you after the talk today to check out her body of work. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, I'll try to share my screen first and start with my slides. Just a second. Okay. Is everything okay now? Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for having me today. My name is Mila Kolpashnikova. I'm currently an assistant professor at Western University. We actually rebranded it, so we have like a wider orientation towards like students, not just for Western Ontario students, and it's in Canada, in Ontario. My talk will be centered around gender with a focus on gender differentials in time use and also on new methods in time use research, particularly sequence analysis and the potential of using machine learning methods, and again, with specific application of transfer learning. I put an interrobang at the end of the title just to communicate that my goal here is to provide ideas for new explorations using time use data, where not many researchers have done any substantial work before. And I hope some of you will be interested in pursuing these unexplored methods for your research, and we collectively then can advance time use research together. So I am what is called a time use researcher. We use a specific type of data from time use surveys, and these time use surveys collect the daily activities of respondents for a 24-hour period. And this is called a time use diary. How they are collected depends on a country, but in general, they collect the information that you see on the slide. So that includes activities, the start and the end of those activities, as well as things like where and with whom this activity was performed. For the US data, the diaries usually start at 4 a.m. in the morning and last until 3:59 a.m. in the next day. The easiest and the best in terms of usability data, in my personal opinion, is the American Time Use Survey Extract Builder from IPAMS. If you want to start using time use data, I think that's the best way to do that. So before we begin, first of all, I would like to speak a little bit about who I am in terms of my research, and hopefully it will help you to form a little bit of an idea about my overall research area. So like for many sociologists, my research is driven by an overarching purpose to improve lives and well-being of marginalized groups, which is apparently a very radical idea in this political landscape. So even vanilla sociologists like me who study gender inequalities are now also radical sociologists. So in my research, I focus mostly on gender and age inequalities and also time use. So this means that I analyze inequalities in social outcomes by these groups, by gender, by age, and also to some extent also by health status. In my research of gender inequalities, I focus on division of housework, family care, unpaid work, and in general, total work time. And this is perhaps the area where I have published the most. And in the study of intersectional and cross-country inequalities, I work on the analysis of unpaid work across gender and race in Canada and the US, as well as analyze these topics across different contexts, with a particular interest in East Asian societies. In the study of aging, I look at family caregivers, the division of housework among retired adults, and this is where I got this short grant, the SSHRC grant, and currently I collect interview and survey data to study how retired adults divide their housework activities. And then a little bit of a different direction of my research, but still connected to this area of aging, is I study what is called the fear of falling, or sometimes it's also called concern for falling. Then methodologically, I work with visualizing and the new types of analysis of time use data, which I will be mostly covering in today's work. So, and also at the bottom of the slide, I arranged papers I published in each area topic, and those highlighted with a dark green border are papers using time use data. So I think it is quite fair to say that most of my research output uses time use data. So in today's talk, I'll review my previous and current work with visualizations and sequence analysis, and discuss the possibilities of applying machine learning models, particularly deep learning models, to time use data. My general goal for this talk is to highlight to you some of the ideas in time use research where no or very little research has been done before. So I think also I can also show you the areas where the time use research could benefit from more exploration by a wider range of different researchers. So I will start with a discussion of various visualizations that are available for the analysis of time use data, and show you examples of my previous and current work in this area, like the one cited on this slide. So this work is centered on a specific time use data visualization and comes from the paper that we co-authored with Celine Lee and Amélie Kennel-Vallée from McGill University, and it's titled Visualizing Daily Time Use on Housework in Canada. And this was published in Socius, and Socius actually can Socius allows publications of visualizations, which is really, really a great thing. And in this paper, we looked at analyzing housework across age groups and gender by time of the day using the Canadian General Social Survey, which also has a time use module. So let me just summarize some findings, or more precisely, observations from this work. So if we can actually depict the percentages of men and women engaged in housework throughout the day using this graph. And this type of graph is usually referred to as a tempogram in time use research. This specific tempogram is flipped vertically so that the vertical axis represents the time of the day, starting from the morning at the bottom and then progressing to the evening at the top. And the left graph illustrates the percentage of men involved in housework, while the right graph represents the same thing for women. And the animation shows changes across different age groups. So basically, as individuals grow older, the percentage of both men and women participating in housework increases. Those above 55 tend to do more housework than younger people. Also, a higher proportion of people engage in housework during meal times, so at around 12 p.m. and 6 p.m. And as people age, more people engage in housework at lunchtime rather than at dinner time. So this suggests that our housework habits may be changing as we grow older. Of course, we cannot really draw those causal links. We need to run a proper age period cohort analysis on longitudinal data, but those longitudinal data are not always available with time use surveys, including for Canada. Most significantly, we can see that there's a consistently greater proportion of women doing housework compared to men, and this is regardless of age. So gender differences persist across all age groups. And one thing with visualizations like this is that it is not actually possible to publish them in articles as they are, right? For the publication itself, we just used each of those age group graphs in a separate figure panel, like the one you see on this graph. And as I mentioned, this type of a visualization in time use research is usually called a tempogram, which basically shows activity density by the time of the day. And this tempogram includes only one type of activity, housework, while there are also other tempograms that can cover any type of activities that are done during the day. So, for example, in this one, on this slide, the tempogram is quote-unquote horizontal, and that is where we have the time of the day on the x-axis, and it also includes more categorized activities, not only housework. And all of those activities are presented in this tempogram. So we can basically figure out what proportion of population did what type of activity at any given time. So because this tempogram is from ATUS-X, it starts at 4 a.m. in the morning, and we see that this light green color indicates sleep. So we can say that at 4 a.m., the vast majority of respondents were asleep, and then there's changes in the proportion of people doing different activities throughout the day. Another way how we use data, how time use data can be visualized is using chord diagrams. This graph shows transitions from one activity to another, and in this case, for the entirety of the population. So there are some new research emerging in time use research that looks specifically at transitions from specific activities to others. So for example, one could study how many people go to grocery shopping after work with perhaps some travel in between versus people who shop during weekends instead of during weekdays. And then this activity does not have to follow any type of paid work activities. In general, there are multiple opportunities, I think, in terms of looking at specific transitions from activity to activity, which can also be limited to specific time frames, say only those in the morning or in the evening. So for example, we could compare people who start working at 8 a.m. versus those who start work at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m., and then compare the demographic backgrounds. These types of questions have not yet been explored to the full potential of the time use data, and let alone explored in their differences across gender or age or any other category. So for those types of explorations, I think this type of visualization could be useful. So the other thing is also that time use data can also be represented on maps. However, we need to remember that time use data is not always representative on different geographical division levels. So if you look at the right graph, so this is gender gap in housework time for older people across provinces in Canada. And we can see here that in general, the gap is narrower in the west with lighter colors and wider in the east, except for the Atlantic provinces. So basically that is to say, for example, that the housework is more gendered in Ontario compared to British Columbia. So in Ontario, we see it's around the gender gap in housework is around 41 minutes, and in British Columbia, it's around 32 minutes. And there are also two provinces that stand out. The largest gender gap in housework is in Saskatchewan, and the narrowest is in Newfoundland and Labrador. One is exception in the West, Saskatchewan. Why it happened, I don't necessarily know, have the explanation at the moment, but I have the explanation for the other part where, for the Maritimes, which joined the Canadian Confederation much later than other provinces. So with the conventional visualization of time use data using ggplot in R, I have also worked on developing packages that integrate R and JavaScript, which create more type of interactive visualizations for mostly online platforms. And this is still currently in the process of improvement, but I hope to submit the packages to CRAN and get a paper out of this at some point in the near future as well. So let me go first to this visualization. Just a second, I'll show it here. So for instance, with tempograms here, if you go into tempograms, we can actually have it more interactively, where right now you see the number of observations for different types of activities across like different time slots during the day. So for instance, we can also isolate one type of an activity and just see the distribution across different time slots as well. So this is for TV watching, and we see that in the evening there are more people obviously watching TV. Can go back, and then instead of say observations, we also can arrange them by percentages and just see the percentages of people doing different activities across this diary day. Other visualizations are going to say to the score diagram, right? Instead of just having the score diagram, if we doing it interactively, we can isolate each of those transitions. So for instance, we can look at transition from travel to leisure activities that they constitute around 3.41% of all transitions, and then transitions from housework to eating around 4.26% of all transitions, et cetera, et cetera. Other things of visualization is also, for instance, maps. I'm not going to show it right now, but here the visualization that you might have encountered somewhere online, and a lot of people in time use research like doing them, is these, where they basically show like where people move, like each of these bubbles is a person moving like from one activity to another. So in the morning hours, we had more people in the sleep activity than around 9 a.m. We have more people at work activity, etc. Similarly, so these are created with JavaScript D3 library, and the movement of these bubbles is a little bit different. So in the older version of D3, so it was something like this, and the one that you saw before, it's the more latest version of the D3 library. So this one is actually kind of cooler, I would say, in terms of like the movements that it does. So you'll see like a lot of people trying to replicate those, and you'll see like time use researchers like these moving bubble type of visualizations. All right, let me go back to my slides. All right. One way to actually make use of the entire information in time use diaries. And what I mean here is that usually when a lot of people, when we use time use data, we just look at the duration of certain activities. So we look at, say, number of minutes spent on housework, instead of like looking at the entirety of the diary, right, where there's a sequence of different activities done by a certain person. So sequence analysis is actually helps us to make use of the information in the entirety of those diaries by representing them as sequences. And sequence analysis helps calculate similarities and dissimilarities between time use diaries, which then consequently can be clustered into like a number of categories or number of clusters based on their, let's say, daily lifestyles. One of the works I did with sequence analysis is on the time use of family caregivers in Japan with my co-author Mani Khan. I have also published a few tutorials on how to do sequence analysis in R, which you can find on OSF. And if you need a link, I think you can find it easily on my Google Scholar profile. In this paper, we ran sequence analysis on about 3,500 diaries and identified 7 clusters for weekdays and 6 for weekends. For example, on this slide, you can see the descriptive statistics on the mean time of their activities, and these mean times for different activities actually helped us to give the clusters their names. So for example, we called the cluster with the highest average of housework time, quote unquote houseworkers, and the one with the highest average of paid work time as quote unquote overworkers. Similarly, we also use the averages for activity time to define the names for the weekend clusters too. So we have names such as part-time workers, full-time workers, leisurely, so people who do spend majority of their time doing leisure activities, and then houseworkers, and intensive. This is intensive adult care performed on weekends. Most of the identified weekday clusters had kind of a counterpart on weekends. So for example, we see patterns for full-time workers for weekdays on the top left panel and for weekends on the bottom left panel. And x-axis here, as you remember, is the time of the day, and y-axis is the proportion of observations. We see that for this category, most people are at work around 9 a.m., both on weekdays and weekends, and also notice that many of the Japanese full-time workers have highly synchronized lunchtime. So a lot of, you see this dip in between this violet color, so it's basically indicates the lunchtime. And there is, however, more variability in what time people get off of their work, right? So there's I think it's violet, so violet color is kind of reducing a little bit. And then if we're considering future research directions, we could explore how sequence analysis might be applied to time use studies in a way that haven't been fully used before. So for instance, we could compare the synchronicity of lunch breaks, or examine how many full-time workers actually take a lunch break across different countries. So maybe I don't think I saw anywhere this type of synchronicity at taking lunchtime among full-time workers in any other country, but in Japan. But we also need to see that there's some proportion of people who are not actually taking their lunchtime break. And we also could compare like what are the differences between people who are taking lunch break and those who do not. And we might actually find some variation due to various demographic or socioeconomic factors. Additionally, we could also compare the differences for people who get off their full-time jobs at 5 p.m. and those who leave later. So does the overwork pay out or does not? And there's a plethora of unexplored possibilities that we could look into with time use data, and many of us haven't done it yet. So in this paper, we have also found some patterns that have not that were not present on weekends, but were present on weekdays. So, for example, overworkers reported extremely long hours, and they are represented on the top left. And the emergency diaries, how we call them, is on the top right. And although the color of the sequences here in this emergency diaries shows what is categorized as sleep and personal care in green color. Personal care actually also included personal medical care. And after looking into these diaries in a little bit more detail, we were actually able to identify that these were medical emergency care diaries. So we call them emergency diaries. For this paper, our focus was mostly on work-related activities, so including unpaid work. So most of the clusters were formed around these activities. In later slides, I will also show you that actually many of these activities, and specifically paid work time and housework, often dominate the cluster formations or cluster identification. But there are some ways around it as how we could actually find more quote-unquote interesting clusters. In the paper, we also identified the percentages of the total weekday and weekend samples that were taken up by each cluster. And unsurprisingly, we see that there are more paid work clusters on weekdays compared to weekends. But we also see that there is a higher proportion of caregivers that report doing long hours of adult care, which are represented in yellow color on weekends than on weekdays. Right. As to the gender differences by cluster, this table represents average marginal effects, and they show that women were less likely to be in full-time worker or leisurely clusters compared to men, and they were also more likely to be in house worker clusters on weekends. Cluster analysis, therefore, highlights, again, the gender differences in how we spend our daily lives and what activities we do, right? So we kind of cluster in different type of daily lifestyle, if we can call them that. Now, going to the current work with cluster analysis. Together with Ariane Ophir, we are currently working on a paper on the time use of married people of the prime working age between 25 and 54 years old. And we used MTUS data, which we also access through IPAMS. So if you talk about durations, right? So this is more conventional way how time use data has been used before. So, and we used data for 6 countries: Finland, the US, Italy, Austria, France, and Canada. And we started a little bit from this more conventional way and more descriptive way. We see that there are differences in countries' averages of different activities and by gender. And in this specific slide, in all countries, men work longer hours than women, and the Italian men actually reported the longest work time on weekdays, and also the largest gender gap in work time on weekdays is also reported in Italy. On weekends, the only exception on weekends is Finland, where women actually report slightly more work time than men, but the difference is not on a statistically significant level. We also see that Austrian men work the longest time on weekends compared to other countries. These are graphs for housework, and we can see that Italian women report the longest time spent on housework, both on weekdays and weekends, and the gender gap is also the largest in Italy. And as to the caregiving, the longest hours spent on caregiving activities such as, and this includes child and adult care, are in North American countries, US and Canada. So with women spending significantly longer time on caregiving than men on weekdays. And this is probably because of the differences in terms of public support for both childcare and adult care in these two countries compared to European countries. For Finland, we see that there are no significant gender differences in caregiving, both on weekdays and weekends. For all countries in our analysis, there are no significant gender differences in caregiving on weekends. So basically, gender differences in caregiving are mostly pronounced on weekdays rather than weekends. And this one is for physical activities. So on average, people spend more time exercising on weekends than on weekdays. And overall, there appears to be more gender differences in favor of men across different countries who seem to spend longer time than women on physical activities, except in Austria. However, in Austria, the differences are not on statistically significant level, even though they are in favor of women. Then we again ran a sequence analysis, and I know this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I'll try to explain it a little bit. So on the slide on the left side, you can see the full tree of different clusters if we go into the depth of 25 clusters. But based on the elbow solution on the right top, we actually decided to cut the tree at 5 leaves, so 5 clusters, which is shown in the central figure. Previously, I also mentioned that paid work time, housework, and sleep dominate clustering of activities, especially on weekdays. One way to overcome it, which is also used in time use sequence analysis by many other scholars, is to constrict the time to late afternoon to midnight, just to capture those more variety of different activities or more interesting activities. The tempogram the tempograms on this slides show exactly that. So the clusters that are based on restricted time of the day between 4 p.m. in the afternoon till midnight. And on the left side, we can see 2 work-related clusters, and those are the bright green in bright green color, and one with extremely long work hours, and another one that combines with some media time in the evening. In the middle, we see clusters that might be doing a variety of different activities, but what unifies them all together is that they spend considerable time on media in the evening. Then we also have a cluster with a large chunk of time spent on housework, which is in yellow color, and another one with most of the time spent on what we categorized as hobbies, which is in this maroon or dark red color. And actually, the majority of activities included into this hobbies category actually have to do with socializing, but it also includes activities like reading or knitting or other types of hobbies. But I think it would be safe to say or safe to assume that these are mostly people who socialize for a large chunk of their afternoon and evening on a diary day. Now, these are the results for the weekends. And for the weekends, again, following previous research, we constricted the sample not from afternoon to midnight, but from 6 a.m. to midnight, because weekends I usually have more variety in their activities. And going from right to left, the cluster numbered 1 represented people who were doing various types of activities, but they did not form their own cluster, maybe just unified by the fact that they were had some media or TV watching in the evening. Then cluster number 4 shows people who are socializing or doing hobbies on the weekends because of this dark maroon color. And then cluster number 5 indicates people who spend most of their days on weekends on media, because this red is basically across the entirety of the day. And then cluster number 2 are those who spend weekends on housework. And number 3 on work activities and perhaps a little bit of media in the evenings. From these, we see that even when we constrict the times for the analysis, although we get some interesting clusters for sure, it does not necessarily deviate from main activities that still dominate many people's days, and that's paid and unpaid work. So we still get the paid work clusters and we still get unpaid work clusters as well. So if we run a multinomial regression with the base being working people on weekends, the gender differences show that women are more likely to be overrepresented in this mixed activities clusters or housework clusters and underrepresented in media cluster. So basically what it means is that women are more likely to be doing housework or some other activity rather than spending weekends watching TV. So sequence analysis is great, but sometimes we need to cut the tree at a lower number of clusters. So we kind of restricted in how many clusters we can look into. And as a result, we might actually miss a lot of interesting groups of people, such as, for example, people who are spend their evening on cultural activities on weekdays, right? Or doing some volunteering activities or exercising on weekdays. Afternoons or evenings. And also we can miss people who spend their entire day on physical activities on weekends or spending their weekends providing care, whether it's childcare or adult care. So we might find other ways to perhaps theoretically identifying those sequences of interest. So for instance, maybe we are interested in people who are doing cultural activities after work, right? Then we can create that type of a sequence and then basically calculate the similarity of all other sequences to that one and perhaps use this raw measure of similarity or have some kind of a cutoff point to identify them as these are people who are doing cultural activities after work and the rest aren't, and then go from there. Now, in the final section, I would also like to discuss some possibilities of applying some machine learning models to time use data, which I don't think have been done ever before because I haven't encountered any work on this. So in my research of fear of falling among older adults, right, this is my other direction of research, I deal with what is called signal data. And during my time at York University, where I was under supervision of Shetal Desai, I actually collected and analyzed eye tracking and biosensor data for predicting potential fear of falling. So for example, on the right side graph, you see raw and filtered signals from an accelerometer. And these signals are then taken and then fed into some machine or deep learning model to predict occurrences of fear of falling. And I also, for this specific paper, which I'm still working on, I also used what is called transfer learning. And transfer learning is a machine learning technique where a model that was developed for different task then is reused as a starting point in another task. So usually it is researchers use image classification models because they have like high precision and they are really, really performative and use them for basically predicting whatever outcomes they have. However, to use those image classification models, your inputs into those models have to be images. And for instance, they shouldn't be signals. Signals, they are usually just numbers. So in signal data, how we usually do it is separate those signals into windows, and then in each of those windows, we kind of combine all type of signals that we have, and then we transform it into a spectrogram, which is basically an image, and then all of those spectrograms are fed into this transfer learning model, and then we predict whatever outcome we have. So in this case, it's potential fear of falling. So when we think of time use data, it is actually can be thought of in a way as a signal data, and it can. And there is actually a much easier way to transform it into an image and then feed into this transfer learning models. So, for instance, so for instance, in this slide, and I'll try to explain it. Additionally, like unlike sequence analysis, what happens in sequence analysis, we kind of have to categorize a lot of activities into categories, broader categories. So we sometimes are constricted to the number of activities we can use. But in this case, we can actually use all activities coded, say, by ATUS, right? And we can then map all of those ATUS activities to different RGB colors. And then if we plot them, they might look a little bit psychedelic or crazy, like on this plot. But it's basically, you can use any, every information about every activity that is available. And but the main point is that we can actually create those images for pre-trained image classificators to be able then to use them for transfer learning, right? So we have, and we can use the entirety of that information of time use diaries. So pre-trained models for image classifications are usually huge and difficult to train on your own. So that's why it's usually easier just to use a model that are available and already trained. And there are multiple models available. And in this case, for testing them, specifically for this presentation on predicting gender of a person based on their time use diary, I used a model called ResNet 50. So far, the best result that I could get from this model to predict gender of the respondent based on the diary was with an accuracy actually of over 90%. However, this is together with overfitting. If we actually use it on a validation test, then the best so far I could get is 66%, which is still a incredibly big number compared to conventional regressions, let's say. But does this mean that we can predict gender from activities? I would say likely no. But would be so would we be able to predict gender if we had more diaries than we have, say, in the entirety of ATUS data? I still don't think so, but it means that we can actually now identify using these models. And this is in analogy with housework type, because housework sometimes is typed in this, what is called female typed housework, male typed housework, and gender neutral housework, right? We could use these then this analogy to time use diaries. We could type them into female type diaries, male type diaries, and diaries that are quote unquote gender neutral. And then using this model, we could classify them into those say 3 categories or more if we can theoretically think about them. And then we can analyze those to see what makes these diaries fit into those categories, whether it's the activities that they do or whether it is the way how they report their diaries or even completely something else. So another thing is also that although we cannot probably predict things like gender from these diaries, there might be some things that we might predict. And I don't know yet the answer to this question, but it could be perhaps socioeconomic status or educational level of people reporting these diaries. And I think it is an interesting way to go and explore the possibilities and research using these methods that are used in other disciplines. So I would like to conclude my talk on this note, and I put my email on the slide in case if you want to reach out about potential collaborations. And thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much. So folks are welcome to type questions into the chat, or because it's open for everyone, you're also welcome to raise your hand and we can let you speak, whatever you're more comfortable with. So.
I have a question. Thank you for a wonderful talk. It was very engaging, and thank you for bringing our attention to this. Seems like underused data source. So I have a question about the data source itself. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we can understand to what extent we can sort of leverage this data source to understand population level behaviors. Because I guess I'm very unfamiliar with this data source, so I'm curious to what extent, how you can talk about this data, for example, comparing it to our go-to survey data sources from observational research. And so just broad question about the data. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I think it's time use data is a little bit specific, right? Because as I said, it's kind of collects the information for an entire day that respondents report. And in a way, it is one step before those sensors. Let's say, so this is something that is self-reported diary, right? But then the next step is complete sensor-based information on the activities of the people, which is usually done by sensors. But on this, how can we use this one, right? I think there are a lot of methodological ways how this could be useful, specifically when we have some missing data and filling out, I don't know, like dealing with missing data. I think these methods could actually help us to deal with that. But on the general level, what these data sets have been used before, it's mostly for studying things like this housework or like some separate type of activity like caregiving, or also paid work time and And like usually it's always like focusing just on one activity, then the duration of that activity is studied as, say, a dependent variable or independent variable.
Any other questions? Because I guess I had one. Is one of the issues with time use data is when people are multitasking, for lack of a better way to talk about it. So how do you? It's not always very common, at least in some of the data sets that I've used. But like in your experience, how do you sort of deal with that? And then do you see patterns in terms of, thinking about like adult care with child care or things like that?
Yeah, there's some recording of secondary activities as well in ATUS, and I think it is specifically relevant to the care activities, like child care and adult care, where usually people are doing something else, but they are also doing adult care or child care simultaneously. And I think I've seen work before other people trying to estimate the time of childcare based on those secondary activity measures as well. So there's still some obviously difficulties in terms of the precision of measurement of those time spent doing whatever activity it is, but it is one step better than self-reported survey time, but one step worse than actual sensor data of seeing what people were doing.
I just wanted to clarify, like the step worse that you're talking about, is this has to do with generalizability of the data?
With precision, in terms of like how much time people are doing something. So, for instance, if you ask, I'll talk about housework, for instance, right? If you ask it in a survey data, right, saying like how much time do you usually spend on housework during a regular week or something, right? They will report like, I don't know, 10 hours or something. And then when you look at the, say, diaries, then you know precisely how much time, well, not precisely, but with more precision, how much time they spent on doing housework on a diary day. And then you can interpolate that into, say, a week long, right? And there were like studies showing also like that time use data is much more accurate in terms of estimating the time spent on different activities. And then, if you go into measurement, that precision of the measurement again, then if we have sensors that are, exactly measuring what people are doing, then we have much more precise measures of what, how much people spend on different activities.
Okay, that makes sense. But I guess I'm also like trying to wrap my head around about this, like when my earlier question alluded to this generalizability question. It is a population level data, right? How can we ensure that this is in some way, because we're collecting a very small percentage or asking very small percentage of people. Census does it in its own way of we have all this weights applied to population, to individuals, so we can calculate the population level representative sort of estimates. How does it translate to this data? Just help me. I'm like totally ignorant. Help me understand.
Are you asking whether ATUS is nationally representative? Or?
Yes, in a way. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is nationally representative. So in a way, it is generalizable to the population level. Yeah.
So the implication is that we can link it to the data that is nationally representative.
Yeah. No. ATUS is nationally representative. Mm-hmm. The American Time Use Survey is nationally representative. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? if not, thank you so much. We really appreciate your talk. And as Mila said, you're welcome to reach out to her. She put her email up. But like I said, I would also recommend you look at her work and some of the things on her website, because I think it's really cool. So
thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming. Bye.